Live from the Orion Cygnus arm of the Milky Way galaxy, this is Scientifically Speaking, a weekly half-hour program devoted to elegant curiosities, and I am one of your hosts, Sarah Chang, and joining me, as always, is Bernie Rhyme, DJ Star Watcher. How are you, Bernie?
Yes, hi Sarah, very good.
Awesome. Bernie is our professor of the astronomy lab at USM and also the author of the monthly What's Up column in the Portland Press Herald. So reach out to us at WMPG Scientifically Speaking at gmail.com or on Twitter at WMPG Sci Speak. You can DM me, ask questions, but that's where I try to post periodic updates. So Bernie,
Yes,
what is up in the night sky this coming week?
yes, good. I'm glad you asked. Well, we have a good week. The main reason would be you can still see Comet Neowise for several more weeks. I did look several nights in a row. I think I saw it vaguely the other night. It was kind of overcast, but I'm pretty sure I saw it. Not good enough to photograph or to confirm it 100%. But it's near the Big Dipper. It's up as soon as it gets dark enough, and it probably stays up till like almost midnight. So we talked a little bit about that last week. So basically, Jupiter and Saturn are up much earlier now. They're up actually before the sun sets. They're actually both just past opposition, so they're basically up all night. I saw them the other night through the haze. And if you want to see Venus, you have to get up early. That's only in the morning sky. And Mars is starting to come up just before midnight. So you can see three nice bright planets in the evening sky. So the moon will be what's called a waxing crescent moon, which is a very nice phase. It's my favorite phase because it's very picturesque. It sets a few hours after sunset, and when it gets out of the way, then you can look for faint things in the sky like galaxies and nebulas that you wouldn't be able to see with a full moon, or in this case, a comet you can look at also. So the moon will be 4 days old, about 18% lit. And the thing to look for in a waxing crescent, and you can also see this on the waning crescent if you get up early, but people can see the waxing, is to look for the Earth shine. That's the sunlight bouncing off the Earth and back to us. I call it twice reflected sunlight. And, a lot of my students, they probably had seen this, but they weren't really aware of it every time when I bring it up each semester. So maybe a lot of people hadn't seen that or looked for it, and that's what you'll see every waxing crescent moon when it's still fairly close to the sun. So we have a really good week coming up with those kind of features in it.
That's
Yes.
awesome. Thank you for that, Bernie.
Sure.
So, if Bernie talked too fast, you can also check out the monthly What's Up column in the Portland Press Herald. For today's episode, I titled it "What is Real Science?" So, Bernie, you have this person. He's a celebrity, right?
Graham?
In some ways, yeah.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure a lot of people. No, of course, they know. I mean, his book sold 10 million copies and he's written 20 books. He's a celebrity. Actually, it's a funny story. A student about 10 years ago told me about him. So I had actually never heard of him until
Oh,
about
wow.
10 years ago.
Okay.
I don't personally have his books, but I'm really into what he's teaching now. So, yeah.
Yeah. So he's kind of, I guess I don't know him that well, but just based off of what I know, and we're going to learn more,
Mhm.
I feel like he's kind of like a fringe, on the fringe kind of celebrity about science, right? I know you kind of use this term like pseudo archaeologist, but he's somebody who I guess really enjoys and has a passion for archaeology and history and understanding kind of our world through the lens of history and perspective on history, because as we are always experiencing, history is only as true as the people who tell it and pass it on. And so, it got me thinking of, and this part is not so much science, but there's an aspect of science that is about our ability to speak and our charisma and our ability to persuade. I had a friend once who he was really annoyed that of the people who are famous and well known,
Mhm.
they're kind of celebrities, right? Like the Kim Kardashians, the people who are
Oh, yeah.
overly dramatic, and they lead and have these lives and show off these lives in the limelight. Why aren't, say, Nobel Prize winners, why aren't they considered celebrities? And so, in some ways, there's a lot of people who are like, how do we make science sexy? How do we make it cool? I mean, in a way, that's what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to tell it in a fun way. We're trying to share really interesting things, things that make us curious and want to learn more. And we want to share that with the world, right?
Mhm.
And I think, whether or not we're successful kind of depends on if our listener base is like, oh yeah, Sarah really said this really well, or Bernie really told that story in a really interesting way, such that I like remember it, right? And so, persuasion is really interesting because it's kind of like truth and justice. Those are things that are fact. But if you lose in convincing somebody that something is true, then it's your fault because you failed at persuading that person, right? You failed at presenting the evidence in the best way. And that's the case with a lot of situations is like, you try to persuade someone that your side or your point of view is correct or better. And sometimes your point just doesn't get across. And so there's really like no better way to defend yourself than kind of to work on this skill of like persuasion. Similarly, you can persuade people, either right or wrong. But I just wanted to kind of set the tone. Our strategies that Aristotle kind of laid out, we have to have credibility, we have to use reason, and then we have to kind of play into emotion. And that's kind of like our way of demonstrating that what we are trying to prove has been clearly demonstrated. That's in a lot of ways that's the foundation of what we're talking about here for today. And so you mentioned his name, Graham
Graham
Hancock.
Hancock.
Tell us a little about him.
Okay,
What's
well,
his
he's basically a
background?
journalist, but he has co-written some of his books with a geologist and architect named Randall Carlson, who's also traveled the world giving lectures. And what about I like about Graham and Randall's in this case approach? They go to all these places and do the actual research for themselves. I mean, in a way, they might be even more scientific than a college professor that basically just teaches the same thing and, doesn't go to some of these places and think of new explanations for things they see. I mean, everyone agree what happened, like these floods we're going to be talking about, but they don't all agree the cause and how it happened and that type of thing. But he goes, he has the new theories, and as I said, he's written like 20 books. We'll discuss, I'll give the names of the books so our listeners can
Yeah.
get them if they want. We're not pushing books per se, but so one is called Magicians of the Gods, and that was a follow-up. This was written about 5 years ago. That was a follow-up to Fingerprints of the Gods, because he's done his research around the world. But we're going to just focus on North America. And his latest book, just about a year old, is called America Before, and that talks about the Amazon and this huge civilizations they found there. So we're not going to get into that in this show, because that's a whole nother topic that just extends the whole lost civilizations into an even greater aspect than what we're going to just cover with North America today.
What were some theories that you found interesting?
Well, in The Magicians of the Gods, basically he takes that period, the Younger Dryas, which if you follow the geology part, that was a very sudden evolutionary event that an asteroid, a comet, hit the Earth about 12,800 years ago. And it was actually not just one impact. They found one crater in Greenland under the ice sheet because it's melting so fast now that's probably about 20 or 30 miles across. So that was probably a 1 mile wide piece. But from 12,800 to 11,600 years ago, a whole series of asteroids were hitting us. So they caused a very dramatic end to that ice age, basically, and flooding across North America. And they saw evidence of rapid floods. The very quick dying out of all the woolly mammoth and saber-toothed tigers and all these huge megafauna. It died out very quickly. The old theory is that the hunter-gatherers, were just so efficient and shot them all, but that there must have been other reasons for them to die out, and that there were other civilizations that had evolved further than us that were actually had all this knowledge, but the evidence of that was completely wiped out because how dramatic and complete these floods were. It was probably the biggest floods, on Earth ever, and they found evidence for these things that would have wiped them out in that fashion. So it's a new way of looking at it. And then what he gets to beyond that is the wisdom of these lost civilizations and what they've created. And there's other places in the world where some of these things are being found. And one, for instance, is Gobekli Tepe. So that is a place in Turkey that is over 10,000 years old. It's the first most ancient temple on the earth. Again, nothing before that exists because of this asteroid impact that wiped everything else out. So what they're thinking about this is not that the farmers in Turkey were able to build this, or hunter-gatherers still at that point, but there was a more intelligent civilization before that that was passing on its knowledge, and they were able to build these amazing things in Turkey and lots of other sites that would directly give you some evidence for those things. Generally, archaeologists don't like the idea of sudden things happening to cause
Mm.
evolutionary shifts and civilizations we didn't know about. However, Stephen Jay Gould, we actually got to see one of his lectures in person many years ago at Harvard, which is kind of neat, like 20 years ago. And he had a whole new theory called punctuated equilibrium. So this is a
Ooh.
natural event. In that case, it was the one that killed the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. And now we're talking about a much more recent event, only 12,000 years ago. But that could drive evolution and change things very rapidly. And he's a very mainstream scientist, evolutionary person. We've actually talked to him afterwards and everything. So there are these other theories and things happening. And as Graham just links it into other civilizations, and for 65 million years ago, there were no modern humans. But the point that Graham and his co-author Randall Carlson do make is that the modern human with the capacity we have now is about 200,000 years old. So, and what we're talking about is only about 12,000. So there were 7,000 generations of basically no development. That doesn't really make a lot of sense. We may have reached the pinnacle of civilization many times, and this was the point beyond which everything was wiped out, and they were trying to transfer that. So that's what makes this so much more exciting and interesting for us now as to what they might have had then. So the more evidence we can find, and people like Graham and Randall, and I'm sure he does mention a lot of other people that look into this, that would make it mean something for us now.
Hmm. Just remind me again, where was the other crater found?
Good point. There was a whole series. I'm not sure. I mean,
Okay.
there's one in Canada. We talk about it in our astronomy club called
Okay.
the Coogan Crater. It's just
Okay.
about 100 miles north of Quebec. And there's one in Greenland under the ice sheet, so they just found it recently.
Mm-hmm.
There's a whole series. I mean, some of the biggest ones were in Africa, but they're not relating to the Younger Dryas flood. They were before then, I think.
Oh, okay. Okay. So those aren't related to that flood event.
Yeah, the Greenland one was, and I think the one in Canada is.
Okay. So those two. I mean, that's it's kind of, I guess, there's probably more to this that you probably haven't shared, but because you're kind of relating that all to the Göbekli Tepe in Turkey,
Yeah.
how, like, I mean, those floods must have been so massive,
Mhm.
or like Turkey was so low, that the
Yeah.
whole, and I'm just curious, like, what are some of the areas that weren't impacted, that allowed.
Probably further south, but actually that's a good point because of what the journal archaeologist's belief was. If civilization started then, they wouldn't literally dig any deeper beyond the levels that would equate to 12 or 13,000 years. Well,
Mhm.
we just literally and figuratively dig deeper, they would maybe find some of that evidence. It was probably
Yeah.
much, but we could find it if we dig, maybe another 50 feet instead of 20. I don't know physically how far down they go. But the distance you go down is related to time. So they
Yeah.
just give up at that level because that was the theory. But if you dig
Mhm.
deeper, you'll find stuff like Göbekli Tepe, and you may find far more amazing things. 100
Mhm.
down, 50, 80
Mhm.
down, whatever.
Yeah.
It's an important point too.
Yeah. So speaking of like temples and kind of things that were built,
Mhm.
there's also like a pyramid, or the oldest pyramid here in North America that you had mentioned, or that
Right.
was wiped out 600. Is that kind of related as well, or is it a
It
different
is,
theory?
except it is. It's called Cahokia, the Cahokia
Mhm.
Mounds, and I got to visit them on my way back from the eclipse that you saw. They're actually in Illinois, but they're very close to St. Louis. You can see the arch from the top of the mound. And the official word is that they started about 600 AD, and they pretty much got wiped out at 1300 AD. So they don't know why. It was the biggest pyramid in this country. It was one of the most advanced civilizations in this country. It was the equivalent of the size of London over 1,000 years ago. I mean, there weren't, millions of people, but there were over 20,000 people, huge civilization. They built mounds and wood henges. They didn't have a stone henge, all astronomically aligned. The biggest mound is called Monk's Mound. I climbed. Now they have a nice set of stairs you can just climb up. And back then it was really interesting. And if that is actually older, or because they don't even know, they had a really nice museum and visitor center with a lot of theories. But if that is older and more advanced than we think, I mean, that would make it really exciting. Not that it isn't already exciting the way it is, but if that was even older, that would be really interesting.
Yeah, yeah. You know, another civilization that I've heard him talk about is Atlantis,
Hmm.
which I found his evidence for it. I mean, I didn't hear that much about it, but just from a kind of high level, I found it slightly compelling because he talks about how, who was it, Socrates or Plato?
Plato.
Plato.
Plato, yeah.
Who Plato was, he writes about Atlantis and how it was
Hmm.
this really advanced civilization, and it's
Yeah.
gone now, it's underwater.
Hmm.
And Hancock talks about how in the pyramids, I don't know which one, he wasn't very specific, but
Hmm.
there's stories of this city having been wiped out, what, 9,000 years plus 600, or I don't remember the numbers, but it
Hmm.
was just so long ago, and it was wiped out because of a flood.
Hmm.
And how he corroborates the flood, he was able to count the number of years. The flood, that year that this major flood happened, corresponds with, I can't remember the name, but it was a tectonic like plate shift that like caused a lot of destruction. And
Hmm.
so, he talks about how like there's no way that that could just be a coincidence. And so he says very similar things. The evidence was wiped out because the flood was so major. I think about this as like when we go back to persuasion, like, oh, the evidence was so conveniently wiped out.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like if you think about like your real life situations, there
Hmm.
are situations where you just don't happen to have evidence, but something is true.
Yeah. And one interesting thing too, the sea levels were 400 feet lower back then.
Mm,
A lot of these things, and Graham himself has scuba dived all over the world. He found all these amazing man-made structures several hundred feet under the ocean that are over 10,000 years old. That they came from that time period, and the ones that weren't actually physically crushed by the earth moving, they just got buried and then underwater and some under earth, of course. But some of those are still there, and you can find them if you interpret it. I mean, he knew they were man-made because there were drillings cores. You're not going to find a rock in the ocean that has a drilling core right through the middle of it. That had to have been man-made. Now it's hard to date that rock because you can't do carbon dating on a rock, of course. But there's other ways you can do radiometric dating. You can roughly tell the age. And a 400-foot difference in sea level that happened pretty quickly. That's pretty amazing too.
yeah, yeah. So do you find his evidence for, let's say, the Younger Dryas period and the comet impact? Do you find it compelling? You
Oh
as
yeah,
as
I
a
mean, any of our listeners have been to Washington State, and you can see this on Google Earth. So I'd look it up for yourself. I have happened to have been to Washington State, but I haven't looked for those things. I didn't know about this then. They have these ripples, and they're instead of like ripples in the sand, it's the same process when the water was flooding down from the north. Except these ripples are 50 feet high and like miles long. And then they have these other, I mean, the way he explained it, I know it's his interpretation. Geologists know the interpretation may vary. Was it a sudden huge flood based on the asteroid impact, or was it a series of smaller floods and so on? But it's there, and they both went to visit. And Randall, his co-author, he talked to a lot of scientific geologists who work out there all the time. So they go and see all this. So that's some of the evidence. And again, it depends how you interpret it. And next time I go to Washington, I'll look for some of those amazing. I can look them up on Google Earth too, like he said.
his whether or not you believe his theories or not, whether or not you're convinced by the evidence that he kind of provides, he has a lot of backlash against scientists, against non-scientists, but he also has a lot of supporters with among scientists and non-scientists. And I mean, I guess how you define a scientist is that definition is a little, I don't know. I mean, so I looked up the term pseudoscience. This is what a lot of people kind of refer to him. You know, he had a whole TEDx thing where he had a talk on. I guess he talks a lot about like LSD and psychotics. One of his TEDx talks, and he had done several, was taken down by TED. There was just a huge amount of like backlash to it. And so they finally like put it up, and they had all these reasons why they took it down. And then so he had another TED talk, and then when that was uploaded to like the TED site, there was caution. This is like pseudoscience, right? And so I looked up the term pseudoscience because I feel like pseudoscience gets applied to a lot of things like, you know, alternative healing, like traditional medicine or things like that. Like that's kind of considered pseudoscience. But now it's much more broad because we have all these people coming up with different theories. They've done their own investigation, their own research. And so like this term, the definition of pseudoscience is really broad. Merriam-Webster defines pseudoscience as a system of theories, assumptions, and methods erroneously regarded as scientific. So I looked at like kind of a couple of other definitions, and they kind of defined it as generally quote unquote science that is done without the scientific method. And I thought that was really interesting because it's like saying that the only way to do science is by following the scientific method. If we're brought up learning the scientific method, you believe that that is the only way to do science. And so then anything else, regardless of how much it is true, regardless of that,
Yeah.
you know, if it wasn't done with the scientific method, it's fake or it's not true. Katie Burke is a writer at the Scientific American, and she wrote this article that was called Stop Using the Word Pseudoscience. She's also a scientist. She talks about how this term kind of makes her cringe because it's a way of framing issues as kind of us versus them, where people who fall under the category of pseudoscience, they're one kind of person, and then the people who aren't are like the smart ones, the ones who believe real science. And that's, you know, that's kind of a risky territory because something that Graham said in one of his interviews was he talks about how the past is kind of this ideology that that when he comes up with a new idea or a new theory, that people immediately they're like, oh, you are challenging my beliefs. You are challenging the reality of science or history from a scientific perspective that I believe to be true. And that's really dangerous because then you kind of it's like you're stuck in the specific mindset way of thinking, and if ever presented with something new, you don't have the humility to then consider that there could be something different, that your reality could be, you know, not what you thought it was. There are many times in past, in especially Western science, there were certain theories and ideas that science felt was true, but then we later debunked them. For
Oh yeah.
example, eugenics.
Hmm.
Um, for example, transgender people, homosexuality. Like those are things that happened in the past where science was used as a weapon, and you know they're defending this reality that people just don't want to let go or think that, you know, is any different. And so what was great about the article was she did also offer alternatives besides pseudoscience. So she suggested replacing pseudoscience with the words such as emerging, still experimental, scientifically inconclusive, scientifically debated, or lacking scientific evidence. And I thought that that was just really pointed of her to use those kinds of terms instead of just like, you know, slapping this is pseudoscience, because we get that from both sides of, for example, the climate change argument. People think that people who talk about climate change, that that's pseudoscience, and people who think about like how climate change is not real, that's pseudoscience too. So it's like which one, like it's become kind of a, it's the word doesn't have any meaning anymore. and we just kind of consider it to be just something that is fake or untrue. But in this case, just like with Stonehenge, there's not a lot of evidence really saying no, right? Or I'm not sure exactly in terms of all of his theories, but
Yeah.
it's hard to disprove them. The takeaway, though, is that we all should have kind of humility when approached with new ideas, even in science, even if like they don't have all of the evidence, right? Because if they have some, it's a possibility, right? Until you can prove it wrong.
And I like that he actually does the research himself and has other people and talks to people around the world and does the things like the scuba diving. I mean, he's not just making all this up. So it could be more real science in a sense. He's just imaginative enough to connect it to something.
Mm-hmm. It
So he's
reminds me
not as
of,
much of a scientist.
yeah, yeah. It
Yeah.
reminds me of Thor Heyerdahl, the
Oh yeah, we talked about him with the boat
Kon-Tiki guy.
segment. He
Yeah,
actually built the thing and drove it,
right,
drove
right,
it,
right. To
sailed it from
actually,
Peru over to, yeah, to prove it
yeah,
possible,
yeah,
and it was.
right. To actually like try to prove his
Yeah.
theory, which I think later was debunked, but he had a lot of conviction in his
Mhm.
theory,
Well, his
and
grandson repeated it on another boat.
oh, did he?
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah, a slightly better version of the original Kontiki.
Yeah. What was the outcome? Did he
He
make it?
made it fine. It was
Did
all
he make it?
possible. I think they got wrecked on the reef right when they got to Tahiti, so he proved that was all possible. But yeah, no, it worked fine.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think we often
Mhm.
underestimate our ancestors,
Mm,
and they may have been way more
way
advanced. And
smarter.
yeah,
Yeah.
because I mean, they don't have all these other things to distract them in daily
Hmm.
life, right?
Yeah.
They like all they are trying to do is figure things out.
Hmm.
Like that is their life, is trying to figure things out and
Yeah.
make things work.
And there
Whereas
was less
we're,
light pollution, so they could see the
mhm,
stars a lot better because all these
yeah,
temples were aligned to the stars, and it meant a lot. The Cahokia mounds, obviously Göbekli Tepe, and a lot of the other places he found, Serpent Mound, and they're all aligned.
yeah.
Yeah, all the new things he's finding in the Amazon, they're all aligned too.
Mm.
So that's another topic.
So, Bernie, final words. What would you say
Yes.
to our audience?
Well, I'd recommend if they're interested that they could either get those books or what I did to kind of prepare for this. As I said, a student mentioned Graham Hancock to me 10 years ago. I listened to some of the podcasts he did with Joe Rogan, and some of them are pretty long. You can just listen to parts of it, but it'll give you an idea directly with him and Randall. And the nice on Joe Rogan, they'll show images. They'll show the pictures in Washington State. They'll show these things other than just listening. And of course, now I know you can also see us, so that's good. But we don't have a lot of images of what he was showing. Maybe we'll get images in the future. But it's all there, and it'll give you a much better sense. Some of these, much more detail, and he's the author himself that has done this. So the final words that we probably could have were much smarter. There's a lot of ancient wisdom that we need to recover and that type of thing.
Awesome.
Hmm.
You have been listening to Scientifically Speaking here on WMPG with myself and Bernie. Stay tuned for songs from Power Out with DJ Cole. And from your favorite nerds, we wish you safe viewing and clear skies.